I still remember the exact moment my daughter-in-law Jessica smiled across my kitchen table and said, "It's only temporary, Richard, just until we're stable again." My son Daniel sat beside her, avoiding eye contact, stirring cold coffee like he was afraid to hear my answer. People assume saying no to your own child is easy when you're older, but it isn't. It feels like betrayal, even when logic tells you it's survival. I'm 68 years old. I spent 40 years working construction, ruined my knees climbing steel frames in winter storms, buried my wife Margaret after cancer took her too early, and finally paid off the mortgage on the small 3-bedroom house we built together. That house wasn't just property. It was the last thing in my life that still felt stable. Daniel and Jessica had been married 4 years already, and in those 4 years they'd moved apartments 5 times, lost 2 cars to repossession, borrowed money from nearly everyone in the family, and somehow always had the newest phones, expensive clothes, weekend trips, and restaurant photos online. Every emergency in their life somehow arrived right after a shopping spree. The first time they asked for help, I gave them $5,000 after Daniel lost his sales job. The second time, I co-signed a car loan because Jessica cried and promised they'd learned their lesson. The third time, I let them stay for 2 weeks after an eviction notice. 2 weeks became 4 months, and those 4 months nearly destroyed my peace. Jessica criticized everything in my home. My furniture was dated. My food was bad for mental health. My wife's old decorations were depressing. She invited friends over without asking. Daniel stopped helping with bills because he said saving money was more important. My water bill doubled. My electricity bill exploded. They fought constantly, usually after midnight, slamming doors while I lay awake listening to my dead wife's house become a battlefield. When they finally moved out, Jessica hugged me and called me family. 3 months later, they stopped answering my calls about the unpaid utility money they promised to reimburse. So when they showed up again that rainy Thursday afternoon with forced smiles and nervous voices, I already knew what was coming before Jessica even sat down. Daniel had lost another job. Their landlord was selling the property. They just needed a little time. Then Jessica added the sentence that changed everything. "Besides, this house is too big for one person anyway." That sentence hit harder than she realized. Too big for one person. Like my life was already halfway erased. Like Margaret's memory was wasted space. Like I was simply an old man occupying a building that younger people deserved more. I looked at Daniel waiting for him to correct her, but he stayed silent. That silence told me more than words ever could. I asked how long they expected to stay. Jessica immediately said maybe 6 months, maybe a year, until things stabilize. I asked whether they planned to contribute financially. She said they needed to focus on rebuilding savings first. I asked what happened to the money from selling Daniel's truck 6 months earlier. She said it was complicated. I asked about the vacation photos from Miami 3 weeks ago. Daniel suddenly became very interested in his phone. Then Jessica sighed dramatically and said something I'll never forget. Families are supposed to help each other without turning it into an interrogation. That was the moment my answer became clear. I folded my hands on the table and said calmly, "No." The room went completely silent. Daniel looked up so fast he nearly knocked over his coffee. Jessica blinked twice like she hadn't heard me correctly. Then she laughed. Actually laughed. "Richard, seriously." I said, "I am serious." Her face changed immediately. No sadness. No disappointment. Just anger. Pure entitlement exposed in seconds. "So you're really going to let your own son struggle when you have all this space?" she snapped. I told her struggling and freeloading were not the same thing. Daniel finally spoke then, saying I was overreacting and that they were family. I reminded him family also repays loans, respects homes, and takes responsibility for their own choices. Jessica stood up so aggressively the chair scraped across the floor. "Wow," she said. "Now I understand why Daniel barely visits you." That one hurt because it was partially true. After Margaret died, Daniel visited less and less each year. But I also knew why. Every visit eventually turned into money requests, favors, or emotional pressure. I told them my decision was final. Jessica muttered, "Unbelievable," grabbed her purse, and walked out. Daniel lingered behind for a second. I thought maybe he'd apologize or at least speak honestly, but instead he said quietly, "You know, Mom would have helped us." I looked directly at him and answered, "Your mother would have helped you once. Not forever." Then he left too. For 3 weeks, neither of them contacted me. Then the family call started. My sister called saying I should reconsider because young people have it hard nowadays. My niece said Jessica was telling relatives I abandoned them during a crisis. One cousin even implied I was selfish for protecting a house that would eventually belong to Daniel anyway. Funny how generous people become with someone else's home. Not one of them offered Daniel and Jessica a room in their own house. Then came the real surprise. One evening, my neighbor Frank knocked on my door holding his phone. "You seen this?" he asked. Jessica had posted a long emotional story online about toxic parents refusing to help family. She never used my name, but everyone who knew us understood exactly who she meant. She described herself and Daniel as victims trying to rebuild their lives while an elderly parent hoarded comfort and space. Hoarded comfort. After 40 years of work, after surviving layoffs, injuries, overtime shifts, and burying my wife, I read every word in silence while Frank watched my face. The worst part wasn't the insults. It was the comments underneath. Friends praising Jessica's strength. People saying older generations were selfish. Strangers calling me abusive without knowing anything about our history. Frank asked if I wanted him to respond publicly since many local people followed Jessica. I told him no. People addicted to victimhood don't care about truth. They care about audience applause. But deep down, I was furious. Not because she attacked me online, because Daniel allowed it. A week later, I received a certified letter from a lawyer's office. Not a lawsuit yet, just a formal request asking whether I'd consider family mediation regarding future inheritance expectations. I nearly laughed out loud reading it. Future inheritance expectations. I wasn't even dead, and they were already positioning themselves legally around my house. That letter changed everything for me. Until then, part of me still believed they were immature and irresponsible, but fundamentally decent people. That letter proved something darker. They weren't desperate. They were strategic. I spent the next month quietly reorganizing my life. I updated my will. I created a trust. I transferred portions of my savings into educational accounts for my 2 grandchildren on my daughter's side because, unlike Daniel, my daughter Emily worked 2 jobs without asking anyone for rescue money. I also made one very difficult decision. I arranged for my house to transfer to a veterans housing charity after my death unless I personally decided otherwise later. The lawyer asked if I was certain. I said yes, because property given without gratitude becomes poison. Then something unexpected happened. Daniel showed up alone one Sunday morning. No Jessica, no attitude, just exhaustion. He looked terrible, older somehow. He asked if he could come in. We sat in silence for almost 10 minutes before he finally admitted they were thousands of dollars in debt. Credit cards maxed out. Personal loans unpaid. Jessica had hidden several expenses from him. They were fighting constantly. He said maybe I'd been right. I asked him one question. Did you come here to apologize or to negotiate? He stared at the floor for a long time before answering honestly. Both. At least it was truthful. He admitted Jessica pushed him to pressure me because she believed the house was basically their future asset anyway. Hearing my own son repeat those words nearly broke something inside me. I told him assets belong to people, not expectations. I also told him the moment they treated my home like an early inheritance instead of my sanctuary, they lost any moral claim to it. Daniel cried then. Actual tears. First time I'd seen that since Margaret's funeral. He said he felt trapped between loyalty to his wife and shame over what they'd become. I told him adulthood means accepting consequences, not outsourcing them to parents. Then I handed him a folder. Inside were contacts for financial counseling, a budget spreadsheet, and information about a small warehouse company hiring supervisors. Real help. Practical help. Not indefinite shelter. He looked confused. So you still want to help me? He asked. I answered. Helping isn't the same as surrendering. He left quietly that day. 3 months later, he called again. This time his voice sounded different. Steadier. He'd taken the warehouse job. Sold unnecessary expenses. Started paying off debts. He and Jessica separated temporarily because, according to him, she refused to change their lifestyle. Then he said something I never expected. You were the first person who loved me enough to say no. That sentence stayed with me for a long time. Because parents often confuse love with rescue. Sometimes refusing access to your peace, your savings, or your home is the only thing that forces someone to confront reality. Jessica still tells people I abandoned family. Maybe she always will. But my house is quiet again. Margaret's